If any missing persons case we've ever covered belongs on the X-Files, it may just be this one. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. On the evening of September 19th, 2004, Colton Springfield and his cousin, Brent Brooks, found themselves with a problem on their hands. The two Crow men were getting ready to head home after an unsuccessful weekend of elk hunting in Montana's Bighorn Mountains, but their failure to bring down any of the animals wasn't really their greatest concern. The much more immediate issue for the two men in Brooks' pickup truck was the fact that there should have been three men in Brooks' pickup truck, and they had no idea where Robert Springfield, Colton's 48-year-old father, was. Robert was the eldest member of the hunting party, a former Marine who grew up hunting these same mountains, and by all accounts, he knew the Bighorns like the back of his hand. Oh god, what's that? However, a recent work injury had left him partially blind in one eye, so when he, Colton, and Brent set out from camp early that morning, they devised a plan to make the best use of everyone's skills. Somewhat similar to the Tom Messick situation up in New York in 2015, Robert would split off from the group with plans to meet up with the other two near an open area where they hoped to drive elk. It seems that the plan was for Robert to track down one of the animals and push it towards his son, who would be in position to take the shot on the other side of the clearing. Though why Brooks was supposed to be waiting with the car rather than backing up Colton isn't really clear from the sources. Several hours later, Colton was in place waiting for his father, but Robert wasn't turning up. The 13-year-old waited at the agreed-upon area for a while, but as the hours ticked by with no sign of Robert, the younger Springfield decided to head back up to his father's Jeep to get out of the cold. It had begun to rain and snow, and Colton was soon faced with a difficult choice. Did he wait for his dad and risk getting stuck as the snow piled up around him, or should he drive back up to the road to wait with Brooks by the pickup? Whether due to confidence in his father's ability to make it out of a bad situation, or a lack of confidence in the Jeep's ability to conquer the elements, Colton opted for the latter option, and thankfully he was able to link up with Brooks without any further trouble. But the same could not be said for Robert, who still hadn't returned even as darkness fell over the Bighorns. Before we get into the story, though, I'd like to take a minute to talk to you about FlexiSpot, which is one of the sponsors who have made this channel possible over the last few years. And I mean that in more ways than one. See, when you sit in a chair in front of a camera for a living, the quality of that chair is pretty important. And FlexiSpot has sent us a lot of chairs. The one you usually see me in is this one right here. That is the FlexiSpot C7 office chair, which is just the basic model, but they also sent us their Lotus recliner, which is downstairs in the lounge. Now, I could go on and on about its 360-degree swivel, the simple quick-release reclining lever, the concealed storage space, and its 20.9-inch wide seat with 9.8-inch wide armrests. But I think this clip of me cuddling Steven on it will probably get the point across more effectively. Who's a good boy? Oh, and the electric version comes with a USB port for charging. And since we're on the subject of FlexiSpot, we also use their E7 Pro standing desks both here at the studio and at home. And there's a lot of reasons why you might use a powered standing desk, but to be honest, my favorite part is that I can set it to one height of like 27.2 inches while I'm researching, and then another of like 28.3 inches when I stream video games on the Aiden Mattis channel on Friday nights. It's also got 440 pounds of static load capacity, so you could stack Aiden and I on top of the desk plus my monitor setup, and it still wouldn't break the thing. But all of that said, the part that you guys probably care about the most is that we actually do use these things, and we genuinely do endorse this product. So if you're interested in upgrading your home or office with a Lotus recliner or an E7 Pro desk, there's no better time than now during the FlexiSpot Black Friday sale with up to 80% off and a chance to get 100% free orders. Check out the links in the description and use code YTE7P50 at checkout for an extra $50 off. And the code is in the description too. As with many aspects of this story, it's not entirely clear how this next bit happened, but Somehow, Colton and Brent managed to get in contact with the Bighorn County Sheriff. Maybe they had cell reception, maybe a satellite phone, or maybe they made their way back along the 50 or so miles of rugged dirt roads to Lodgegrass. But whatever the case, the Billings Gazette reports that a massive manhunt began almost immediately. Deputies from the Bighorn County Sheriff's Office, members of the County Search and Rescue Squad, and a couple of county road maintenance workers searched in tandem with a detachment of deputies and search and rescue members from Sheridan County, Wyoming. But the largest contingent of searchers in those first 2 days came from the Crow Reservation itself. Reinforcements arrived on Wednesday as volunteers and groups including Northwest Canine Search and Recovery from Wyoming, Western Montana Search Dogs, and Hot Springs Search and Rescue funneled into the mountains. The men and women performing grid searches across that 5-square-mile area were fed by employees of the Crow and Northern Cheyenne tribes with assistance from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, who sent food and came to cook for the family and searchers. For a week, through rain, snow, and fog, searchers scoured the area with dogs and on horseback, while a volunteer pilot and former Marine flew a helicopter equipped with infrared equipment up and down the steep canyons surrounding the Bear Hole area where Robert was last thought to be. But despite their efforts, there was no sign of him. And now seems like a good time to bring up one of the other gray areas in this story, that being the exact location where the disappearance took place. Reports interchangeably refer to Bear Hole and Black Canyon, and one article in the Billings Gazette refers to Bear Hole as being in the Black Canyon area, even though those locations are about 15 air miles apart and many more on the ground. It seems like the Black Canyon identification may have more to do with it being the nearest recognizable landmark associated with a population center at nearby Fort Smith, because the command post for the search is definitively described as being at Bear Hole. That last piece is probably the most important part of the story, though, and a large part of why this disappearance can be considered odd to begin with. You see, it's not really any shock when a hunter goes missing in the woods. Sure, it might be a little bit more surprising than if someone with no experience vanishes, but Montana is still a very wild place compared to somewhere like the Great Smoky Mountains. The Bighorns are home to bears, mountain lions, and since they were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park in 1995, wolves. Any one of those predators could easily take down a bow hunter, and especially a bow hunter with severely limited depth perception due to an eye injury. Given the lack of any sign that Robert had made his way anywhere near the rendezvous point, it seemed most likely that he'd either fallen victim to an attack by a wild animal, or that he'd injured himself too severely to use the lighter that he carried with him to start a signal fire. At least that is how it looked until October 21st, 2005. On that cool Friday afternoon, over a year after Robert disappeared, 2 elk hunters were passing through the Bear Hole area when the screeching of a crow drew their attention. They thought nothing of it at first, just assuming it was likely calling out to alert others of a carcass, but something about the bird's calls seemed too frantic to ignore. As one of the hunters would later tell the press, it was screaming like a woman, which was enough to convince the men to give things a closer look. They made their way over to a tree near the source of the cries, and there they discovered something which prompted them to immediately seek out the authorities. That being a set of human remains. It didn't take long for news of the find to reach Robert's family, who drove out to the scene as soon as they heard, only for law enforcement to refuse them access to the site. Try as they might, the Springfields just couldn't get permission from the tribal authorities to approach the discovery, and were instead forced to wait idly by as officials searched the area further and then collected what they'd found. Strangely, authorities refused to tell Veronica, Robert's wife, precisely what they'd actually seen. And a couple of years later, in 2007, she'd tell the Billings Gazette that she still isn't sure how much of her husband was found, as she'd only been told that a skull, a large leg bone, and a few other bones had been recovered. Maybe they were holding off because they didn't know for certain if the remains belonged to her husband, but if there was any doubt, it couldn't have lasted long. You see, alongside the remains, the hunters had found Robert's wallet, as well as his belt and his vest. Yet those finds ended up creating more questions than they actually answered. One of the most important of those questions was, could Robert have been murdered? And there's good reason to believe that the possibility was at the top of the list as far as the authorities were concerned, namely the fact that the FBI arrived on the scene the very next morning. The thing is, the FBI generally responds to homicides for one of a select few reasons: organized crime, trafficking, or by request. Considering that Robert was a middle-aged native man, trafficking didn't seem like a likely reason for them to be there, and there doesn't seem to be any reason to suspect organized crime was involved, so that suggests this was probably a case of the sheriff calling in the big guns. But why would the sheriff suspect foul play? At first glance, there's nothing odd about what those hunters found. People go missing in the woods all the time, and between the bad weather and the predators roaming the area, wouldn't the simplest explanation be that Robert lost his way and fell victim to nature in some form or another? Usually I would say the answer is yes, but in this case there are two important problems with that conclusion. One of them is that his bow and arrows were missing, and his belt was neatly rolled up on the ground. And I realize now that when I was writing this, I forgot to include the third problem, which is that his wallet didn't show any signs of weathering. You know, if Robert had been attacked by an animal, when would he have had time to take off his belt and roll it up next to him? You know, a cougar is attacking you, a bear's attacking you, what are you going to do? Like, just hang on, one moment. Okay, hit me. Doesn't happen. Another question would be, when would he have taken out his wallet and dropped it on the ground? What purpose could this serve? Bears don't care about your debit card. This isn't a situation where you can get out of a mugging by taking out your money clip and throwing it and saying, you go get it. We can also ask, why was there a single hole in the back of his vest, and where did his bow and arrows go? Now, on the other hand, if he fell victim to the elements, well, most of those questions still apply, just with a different interrogative. Why did he take his belt off and roll it up? Why did he take his time to drop his wallet on the ground? When did he leave the bow and arrows behind him? Why was there a single hole in the back of... Oh, that one doesn't change. The sheriff's deputies must have been asking themselves the same questions because, according to Veronica, a law enforcement officer who came to talk to the family the day the remains were removed from the mountain said Robert may have been shot, but there is no official record of that hypothesis. There's another troubling aspect of the story which points to foul play too, that being the location of the remains. The family also believes that Springfield probably died somewhere other than he was found, reports the Billings Gazette. The remains were located in the Bear Hole area, right below where the family had set up a base camp for the searchers in the fall of 2004. Honeybun Medicine Crow told the paper that we could see it from the camp and insisted that they had thoroughly searched the whole area. We would have found him if he was there, she finished. Of course, we have heard that plenty of times before, but this time it's a little different, because another article, this one from the Great Falls Tribune, clarifies that by in the Bear Hole area, what Medicine Crow meant was that the remains were 50 yards from where they had camped during the search. Look, I've changed my mind about a number of disappearances simply because I had the opportunity, I finally had the chance to explore where they happened. It is really easy to sit at home and ask how could someone miss the body when you haven't seen these areas up close. Fact of the matter is that brush alone can get so dense that you can't even get to certain spots without cutting your way through, and there's plenty of examples where the reason someone was later found in an area that was already searched is because nobody thought to check in places they thought somebody couldn't or wouldn't get to. In this case, though, we're talking about a body that was found within 50 yards of the search headquarters, in terrain which is basically split between grassy hills and coniferous forest, in an area searched by at least a dozen different dogs, both scent tracking and cadaver, multiple times across 3 different seasons. Again, there's not many clear details within this story, but the available material strongly suggests that the search camp was set up at the rendezvous spot Robert had identified for Colton. There were searches there every day for at least a week, and then frequently enough over the following month that if Robert found his way to that spot, they would have discovered him. Essentially, the only way that 200 searchers, many of them either experienced search and rescue personnel or hunters, do not find his body just 50 yards from camp is if the body wasn't 50 yards from camp. As always, I will acknowledge that it's not impossible for them to have missed it. It just seems so unbelievably unlikely that it's worth looking into the other possibilities. And then there's the odd behavior of both tribal and federal law enforcement to consider. Remember when I said that the authorities wouldn't allow the family to see the scene of the remains until after they'd already been collected and removed from the area? Well, the family weren't the only people prohibited from viewing the site. According to the Billings Gazette, tribal and federal law enforcement would not allow Bighorn County Coroner Terry Bullis onto the site where the body was found. Not only that, but he was never even permitted to examine the remains. So, what reason could the feds and the reservation police have had to deny Bullis access? One possible explanation is that the Crow Nation wanted to handle the matter internally, since Bighorn County only had limited jurisdiction on the reservation. But that argument falls flat for a couple of reasons. The first is that the Crow immediately released the remains into FBI custody, after which the feds shipped them off to Quantico for forensic analysis. True, that could have been more of a slight at the county, or just a preference for the more advanced technology available to the FBI, but there's an issue with that explanation as well. Robert's family needed a death certificate to collect on his workers' comp settlement and Social Security benefits, and the only person with the authority to sign that certificate was Terry Bullis. Since he wasn't allowed to examine the remains, he was unable to present them with that crucial document. Therefore, by refusing to allow Bullis to examine the remains, the Crow would have been hurting their own people. Of course, there is the caveat that at every stage of this investigation, we're dealing with government bureaucracy, and at 3 different levels no less. Things have gotten significantly better in recent years, but back in 2004, there was an impenetrable spiderweb of red tape surrounding crimes committed on Native American reservations. One of the biggest problems was that tribal police only had the authority to detain residents of the reservation, while county authorities lacked the jurisdiction to make arrests on native land to a large degree. This created a loophole which functionally allowed non-natives to get away with committing crimes on reservations because nobody had the authority to both arrest and prosecute them for it. The only real way around that was for tribal and county police to form joint task forces, but mutual distrust or even a sense of apathy made that a rare occurrence. Even now, after rulings like United States v. Cooley, tribal cops still only have limited authority to detain non-natives, such as on public roads when suspected of committing a crime. They still have to wait for county, state, or federal authorities to come and make the arrest, and they cannot prosecute non-natives in tribal court. With all of that in mind, the decision to turn the remains over to the feds immediately may have been intended to expedite the process and ensure that the case was investigated properly, especially since they did promise to get Bighorn County the information required to produce the death certificate. Unfortunately, expecting the feds to do anything in a timely manner is like expecting the RCMP to care about a missing persons case. It's simply not going to happen.
Boom. Roasted.
To nobody's surprise, that is precisely how things went once the FBI took possession of what was left of Robert Springfield. It should have taken, at the maximum, several months for the FBI's DNA analysts to confirm that the remains belonged to Springfield. Considering the man's unweathered wallet and several of his possessions were found nearby, that should have been a formality in the first place. Given the rolled-up belt and another report which claimed that Robert's shoes were also found there, both tribal and federal authorities should have immediately launched an investigation into how the man died and how his bones and possessions ended up in a place that should have been thoroughly searched multiple times. Instead, those bones sat in an FBI lab for the rest of the year, then the entirety of the next one as well, and most of the following one. Yes, that is correct. It took over 2 years for the FBI to confirm what everyone had known all along. Those bones belonged to Robert Springfield. And of course, there was still a big question here. What actually happened to Robert? Basically, every known fact about this case points towards homicide, but for reasons I genuinely cannot understand, the FBI decided there was no evidence of foul play and concluded its investigation. The thing is, there's no singular aspect of the story which stands out as particularly bizarre. But when everything is taken together, it just doesn't seem to add up. In order for this case to be something other than a homicide, it seems like the only other possibilities would be exposure or a run-in with an apex predator. But looking over the reports, I don't see much evidence for either possibility. There are at least 3 different animals which could have taken him down in the region, but if the FBI found any signs of predation on the bones, they didn't mention that to anyone. Robert was reportedly well-dressed for the weather, would have been carrying a hunting knife with him, and he had a lighter, so he should have been able to start a fire. He was also a Marine veteran, and one article even asserts that he was a Special Forces operative. But there was no sign that he'd even attempted to shelter himself from the elements. And in case you have forgotten, his wallet. If he had been out there, in the elements, for a year, in southern Montana, there should have been weathering on a wallet that was outside of his pants. But no, according to the family, the wallet and the items inside, like his ID, social security card, and so on, had no obvious sign of weathering or water damage. Then there's the issue of where his body turned up. It was so close to the search camp, and the remains were visible enough for hunters that weren't even looking for them to spot them just by following the cries of a crow. Yet somehow, 200 people and at least a dozen dogs performing grid searches for a week couldn't do the same with a full body. If Robert had been there all along, it's just so hard to believe that it could have gone unnoticed by the search teams. Him not being found could be explained by the possibility that he wasn't there while the area was being searched, but if that were the case, then he must have survived in the woods for at least 2 weeks before finally making his way back to the rendezvous point, and that seems highly implausible even for a Marine. It also just doesn't make sense. Someone with his training and supplies could reasonably be expected to build a shelter, get a fire going, and await rescue, especially once he heard the helicopters flying overhead. Again, none of these explanations are impossible. People do make bad decisions, searchers miss things, and dogs aren't perfectly reliable. But this isn't a question of what's possible. It's a question of what's probable, and in this case, I think there's an argument for foul play to be made. To recap, we have no evidence of predation, no evidence that he tried to build a shelter, and no evidence to suggest his body was in the area during the intensive phases of the search in September of 2004. What evidence we do have would imply that if Robert was alive when he arrived at the point where hunters found his remains, he deliberately took off his shoes and belt, rolled up the ladder, dropped his wallet on the ground, sat down against a tree, and died. Oh, and he left his bow and arrows behind somewhere else entirely for some reason. He also did all of this after surviving in the woods for 2 weeks without ever building a fire big enough to be seen by the search parties. In other words, that hypothesis relies on Robert making completely inexplicable decisions at every single step of the way. Now, what about foul play? To be fair, there's not much in the way of positive evidence, material evidence that he was killed. We do have a deputy allegedly saying that the hole in Robert's vest could have been made by a bullet. We have a body turning up almost exactly a year after the man disappeared. That's about it. What makes the foul play angle attractive is the simple fact that it can account for all of the aspects that exposure or predation can't. If someone shot him, carried the body away from the site, and then planted the remains at Bear Hole, it covers all the gaps. There were no signs of predation because there was no predator. There was no shelter because Robert never had a chance to build one. His body wasn't found by searchers because it wasn't there while they were looking. But still, that explanation isn't bulletproof either. If someone shot him, why? Was it an accident? Did he get into a fight with another hunter? Or did someone stalk him into the woods with the intention of killing him? Of the three options, I think that an accidental shooting makes the most sense for a few primary reasons. First of all, we don't need to figure out a motive, which you'd need to explain if you wanted to argue for a stalker. Second, an accidental killing would probably cause somebody to feel remorse, which could be why they returned his remains to Bear Hole and placed them somewhere they would be easily found. Regardless of whether it was accidental, in the heat of the moment, or premeditated, the killer would have a reason to hide the body, but a remorseful killer would be more likely to feel compelled to return the remains to the search area so that the family could get some closure. There are a few reasons why someone who committed voluntary manslaughter or murder might also bring the remains back, but what we're looking to find here is the answer which requires the fewest assumptions, Occam's razor, or in this case, in a weird way, Occam's conspiracy theory. Of all the options involving homicide, an accident seems to be the one that fits the bill best. But is that necessarily the case when we bring in the potential for animal predation or exposure? Personally, I think the answer is still yes. The biggest question mark in this case is how did the searchers miss his body? And unless we're willing to accept that a grid search managed to miss a body lying within 50 yards of its starting point in relatively open terrain, and that a wallet sat out in the elements for a year without sustaining any water damage, it seems like homicide is the only possibility which accounts for all the gaps. That does come with a major caveat though. I haven't been out to this location, so all I have to go on is map software. Maybe it is the kind of place where you could miss someone even with a grid search, and maybe this was just another story of someone getting lost in the woods. I just don't know. What I do know is that the Springfield family felt very strongly that it wasn't that simple, and that they even went as far as joining another family's lawsuit against the FBI in 2009. The suit, labeled Cole v. Federal Bureau of Investigations, alleged that the FBI refused to do anything but the most cursory investigation into the death of Stephen Bear Crane Cole, who was shot and killed by a co-worker named Bobby Jean Holcomb at Leachman Cattle Ranch after the latter claimed that Stephen kicked in the door to the bunkhouse and attacked him with a knife. Authorities sided with Holcomb, even though photos from the crime scene plainly contradicted Holcomb's story. You see, the knife he claimed Stephen attacked him with, when law enforcement arrived on the scene, that knife was not only sheathed, but it was also underneath an electrical cord, which was itself underneath Stephen's body. So, in order for Holcomb's story to be true, Stephen must have somehow sheathed the knife, dropped it under the cord, and then laid down on top of both objects, all after being shot point blank in the head with a .22 caliber pistol. I won't go into the details of the court case at length, partially because, oh my god, is it a lot of legalese that I don't understand, but the plaintiffs argued that the FBI agents assigned to the case were dismissive of their concerns, rude, and short-tempered. The Native News Honors Project reported in 2009 that shortly after their son's death, the Coles met for a case update with agents Wayand and Oravec, the latter being the lead agent, and that in that meeting, the family says Oravec kept checking his watch and a wall clock, looking down as they talked. And then, midway through the meeting, about 45 minutes in, the lead agent on Stephen's case looked up at his parents and said, "Who's Stephen?" According to Stephen's father, even Wayand, Oravec's supervisor, seemed to be caught off guard by that question. If that is the degree of investigation the FBI was putting into these cases, we gotta question their conclusions. If they weren't even willing to properly investigate a self-defense shooting, and I want to be clear, I am a big proponent of using firearms in self-defense. I stay strapped so I don't get clapped. But if they weren't willing to investigate a self-defense shooting where the alleged attacker was clearly unarmed, then why should we trust that they performed a full and proper investigation into the cause and manner of Robert Springfield's death? Nothing about this situation inspires confidence. Is there considerable evidence that the man was killed by another person, his remains hidden away for a year, and then returned to the scene of the crime? No, but if you don't actually try to find evidence, then you can't exactly fall back on the lack of evidence as an explanation for how you determined something wasn't foul play. It would be different if they spent a few weeks interviewing people in the area and trying to figure out who else might have been in the area that day, or what could have caused the tear in the vest, or what Robert's route might have been on the day he disappeared. Instead, it looks like they shipped the remains off to Quantico and either forgot about them or tried to sit on them until the family stopped asking questions. I believe the explanation given was that there was a backlog. But, come on. And honestly, if they'd at least come out and said it was an animal attack or he definitely died of exposure, we might be able to sit back and say, well, maybe they have reasons they just aren't sharing. But they didn't do that either. They just listed the cause of death as undetermined and washed their hands of the whole issue. It's completely unacceptable, and at the risk of sounding woke, I think it's probably an issue of the justice system being generally apathetic towards Native Americans. Yes, tribal law enforcement jurisdiction is a nuanced issue with hostility on both sides, but that doesn't make it okay for the FBI to drop the ball on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Unless they're hiding something even bigger. As with so many of our videos on missing people, I found this one in the work of our good dear friend David Paulides, which means that at least one person has implied that Robert Springfield was a victim of a Sasquatch attack. If you're familiar with Missing 411 and are about to angrily comment that Paulides never said it was Bigfoot, I'd humbly ask that you first pause this video, go down to the description, and click the link to our video on how David Paulides created Missing 411 to get people interested in Bigfoot. I lay the whole argument out there with citations from David's own books. With that said, this is one story where I actually don't find fault with how Paulides recounted the events. He got a couple of minor details wrong, but overall he's consistent with everything I was able to find on the case. It's also worth noting that Springfield wasn't the only hunter to disappear that fall. He was just the most documented of them. As it turns out, at least 3 other hunters were found dead in the mountains of western Montana and eastern Idaho over the course of the month of October 2004. Not only that, but this time there's actually something to the idea that some sort of unknown creature might be lurking in those same mountains. You see, way back in 1893, future President Theodore Roosevelt published The Wilderness Hunter, which is essentially a commentary on frontier life and all that goes with it, based on his experiences traveling the West through the 1880s. It's a great book overall, but today it's probably most famous for what the author himself refers to as a goblin story, though it's also been titled The Wendigo in some places. According to Roosevelt, it's a story that was told to him by a grizzled, weather-beaten old mountain hunter named Bauman, or Bauman, I'm going with Bauman, who was born and passed all his life on the frontier, about a strange encounter the man had with some kind of monster while on a trapping expedition many years earlier. We've got an in-depth video on this whole story and what it could mean linked in the description if you want to get the full treatment on it, but for the sake of this episode, I'm just going to cover the major points so we can see how it might play into what happened to Robert Springfield. As Bauman's account went, he was trapping with a partner among the mountains dividing the forks of the Salmon from the head of the Wisdom River, which I believe is referring to the Beaverhead Mountain Range. They were not making out very well for the first few days, so they decided to head up into a particularly wild and lonely pass, which supposedly led to a stream with plenty of beaver. But there was a catch. The pass
was evil.
Or at least, it had that reputation since a guy got eaten by an unknown beast incident the previous year, an event in which a group of prospectors discovered a guy got eaten by an unknown beast. That didn't bother Bauman and his buddy, though, so they left their horses at a meadow at the foot of the pass and made their way up into the gloomy forests above. They still had a couple of hours of daylight left by the time they reached a suitable spot and set up camp, so they headed upstream in search of a good place to trap some beaver. When they returned to camp at dusk, however, they found that something else had been there in their absence. And it wasn't a beaver. Presumably a bear, based on the large tracks meandering through the camp. The visitor had rummaged through their things, scattered the contents of their packs, and destroyed their lean-to. Apparently, all for the love of the game. Thankfully, it hadn't decided to stick around long after greeting the new neighbors, and Bauman and his companion were able to fix their shelter and get a fire going before darkness closed in on them. Bauman was working on cooking dinner when the companion, let's give him a name, I'm going to go with Fred for this one, when Fred decided to take another look at the tracks. He grabbed a lit stick, what Roosevelt refers to as a firebrand, spent some time inspecting the prints, and then came back to sit by the fire. And then he just sort of sat there for a while, until he finally looked over at Bauman and said, "Okay, wait, Kurt, the mood lighting. Ready? Thank you." He looked over at Bauman and said, "Bauman, the bear has been walking on 2 legs." Now, Bauman didn't believe Fred at first, but after he too examined the tracks, he had to agree that it did indeed appear that the bear was walking on 2 legs. Something that bears don't really do for extended periods of time. This was an unsettling discovery, especially since they were having a hard time determining if these were paw prints or footprints that they were looking at, so they did what any reasonable men would do under such conditions. They went eepy-buys. They went to bed. This was, as you might expect, not the best plan, and that became very apparent just a few hours later when, at midnight, Bauman was awakened by some noise and sat up in his blankets. Before he saw anything, he was hit by an odor so ominous that it could only be some great wild beast. Or perhaps a Reddit moderator.
Boom. Roasted.
Acting on instinct, he grabbed his rifle and fired at the thing, which would be the correct response in either case, as both are likely to be dangerous predators.
Boom. Roasted.
Now, Bauman missed, but the sound alone was enough to scare off the intruder, and the 2 men took shifts watching the fire for the rest of the night in case anything returned. When the morning came, they were glad for the light, but if they thought their first full day in Guy Who Got Eaten by an Unknown Beast Pass would be better than their first night, they were mistaken. The pair spent most of the day out looking to score some beaver, but as often happens to young men on the hunt, they returned empty-handed. To make matters worse, they found their camp once again demolished by what must have been by then a very angry unknown beast, and once again it appeared that the thing had walked off on 2 legs. By that point, Bauman and Fred realized that they should probably get out of there as fast as possible, but they also knew that trying to navigate through a dense mountain forest at night with some strange angry biped stalking them was probably not the best of plans. So they built a bonfire as big as they could and hoped that the thing feared fire as much as a Reddit mod fears deodorant.
Boom. Roasted.
Thankfully, that seemed to be the case, and though they heard sinister, drawn-out moans throughout the night, the beast stayed away from the fire. When the sun finally arose, the lads had just one plan: get out of Dodge as quickly as possible. They didn't like the idea of splitting up, so they stuck together throughout the morning as they gathered up their empty beaver traps, all the while feeling as though they were being followed. The work went quickly enough, though, and by noon they were nearly finished. There were just 3 traps left, all 3 of them in one spot in a nearby ravine, so Bauman volunteered to go and get those while Fred headed back to pack up their camp. Both men probably thought they'd see each other within the hour, but then Bauman made an unexpected discovery. He'd finally managed to catch some beaver. Those final traps had managed to snag the only 3 animals they'd caught since entering the pass, and despite the concern for the unknown beast, which he'd felt stalking him all day, he decided to field dress the beaver right then and there. Took him a good few hours, and by the time Bauman finally finished prepping his beaver for travel, the sun was beginning to get a little low. He hurried off towards camp, though thankfully without any of the rustling sounds which had followed him and Fred all morning. Soon enough, he reached the edge of the clearing, where they'd set up a few nights prior, where he found that all of their packs had been wrapped and arranged, but something was wrong. The fire had gone out, but more importantly, there was no sign of Fred. Bauman called out for his friend, but there was no answer, and as he stepped closer to the camp, he saw why. Fred was there, but he wasn't doing too great. In fact, he was dead. That's never a good sign. The man lay stretched beside the trunk of a great fallen spruce, and as Bauman got close enough to inspect the body, he found the cause of death: a broken neck and 4 great fang marks in the throat. Bauman surmised from the scene laid before him that Fred must have returned, packed everything up, and sat down to rest against the spruce trunk. Then, suddenly, whatever had been stalking them for the last few days snuck up behind him, seemingly still on 2 legs, by the way, and broke his neck by wrenching his head back with its forepaws while it buried its teeth in his throat. This time, however, the unknown beast didn't bother to eat its victim. No, this kill was all about sending a message. Instead of devouring Fred, the creature had romped and gamboled around his body in uncouth, ferocious glee, occasionally rolling over and over it, before it returned to the dark forests from whence it came. When Bauman later recounted the story to Roosevelt, he seemed to believe that the creature was something either half human or half devil, or some great goblin beast. And wanting absolutely nothing to do with that, he left everything behind but his rifle and bolted for the foot of the pass, praying the ponies were still okay. They were, thankfully, and with that, Bauman left Guy Who Got Eaten by an Unknown Beast pass. Or perhaps, as it should now be known, Guys Who Got Eaten by an Unknown Beast pass. Never to return. So what does that have to do with Robert Springfield? Well, we have to ask the question, if Bauman's story is true, could it be that Robert and those 3 other hunters could have fallen victim to the very same unknown beast described in Roosevelt's book? The answer, unexciting as it seems, is probably not. First off, those 3 other hunters died in ways that were actually very explicable. One had fallen off of an ATV, and I can't remember what the other 2 were, but one guy was in his truck. Just doesn't really scream unknown beast here, you know? More importantly, though, there's a lot of debate over precisely what Bauman actually encountered. Though some Bigfoot enthusiasts point to Roosevelt's goblin story as evidence that the future president believed in Sasquatch, the truth is that the man clearly and explicitly referred to the Wendigo, using the term snowwalker, when given an opportunity to connect it with existing folklore. That's no real surprise either, considering the concept of Bigfoot wouldn't really begin to work its way into European-American folklore for another 30 years. But we don't have time to talk about the Battle of Ape Canyon right now. And anyway, that's not really the biggest problem with seeing this as a Bigfoot story or attaching it to Springfield's death. The more important issue is that Teddy Roosevelt himself discounted the idea that Bauman encountered anything outside of the ordinary. Forgive me for the near-direct quote of myself, but the most accessible and commonly read version of this story comes from Ernest Thomas Setton's 1932 work, Famous Animal Stories. And it is nearly identical to the original as it was published in The Wilderness Hunter, but for one small yet significant difference, where the Setton version of the exposition explains that Bauman knew well the stories told by the Indian medicine men in their winter camps of the snow walkers and the specters and the formless evil beings that haunt the forest depths and dog and waylay the lonely wanderer who after nightfall passes through the regions where they lurk. Roosevelt's includes another line. Rather than leaving it on that mysterious and rather suggestive note, the original version continues on to say that it may be that when overcome by the horror of the fate that befell his friend, and when oppressed by the awful dread of the unknown, he grew to attribute, both at that time and still more in remembrance, weird and elfin traits to what was merely some abnormally wicked and cunning wild beast. But whether this was so or not, no man can say. There are further hints sprinkled throughout the text that allude to Roosevelt feeling that something more mundane killed Bauman's friend. The most obvious is with regard to how the companion in the story died, where Roosevelt clearly describes a mountain lion attack. The use of the term forepaws is probably the most direct, but then there's the bit about how whatever killed Fred romped and gambled around his body in uncouth, ferocious glee, occasionally rolling over and over it. That is something that big cats do, and it seems that Teddy worded it that way on purpose. According to Setton's preface in his reprint, it really was Roosevelt's opinion that Bauman's friend died as the result of a cougar attack. If Setton is to be believed, then Roosevelt told him the story in person, and they agreed that the story might be true in all its main features if we admit that 2 wild beasts were concerned. Setton went on to explain that first, the camp was wrecked by a mischievous black bear, while the creature that sneaked after them in the woods and prowled around their camp uttering strange sounds in the night was a cougar. I'll be the first to admit that I don't really love that explanation, for reasons I explained in our video on the Bauman story itself, but I won't rehash that here since that's not really the objective of this video. The whole reason I brought this up was because I don't think that Bigfoot is a good explanation for how Robert died, and for many of the same reasons, I don't think a wild animal is a good explanation. Even if Bauman's story did indicate that something like Sasquatch existed in the mountains of Montana, it still doesn't fit the story. It doesn't account for why the remains turned up suddenly after a year, why the belt was rolled up, why there was no weathering on the wallet, and so on. Some versions of the Sasquatch story, in which they're described as being tribes of particularly large humans who live in the mountains, might allow for that kind of behavior, but certainly not the one we get from Bauman. When all of the evidence is taken into consideration, I think that only one explanation makes sense, and it is homicide. The question is whether it was accidental, spur of the moment, or premeditated. And the only way to find that out would have been for the FBI to actually do its job and take the possibility seriously when it actually mattered. And this is something I brought up in the past, but if you're American, and if you're Canadian too, because you have the same problem, this is something where we actually do have agency to make changes. We can call our representatives, our senators, we can post about it, and we can push for there to be a focus on fixing the problems with tribal law enforcement as it pertains to its cooperation with county, state, and federal. The laws right now are not good. If you commit a crime on native land and you're not Native American, they can't arrest you, and that doesn't make any sense at all. I understand there are issues with how Native autonomy works on the reservations and how the county responds to it, but the answer to that is not continuing to let it not work. It's getting everybody together and saying, hey, how do we fix this? You know, Native Americans are Americans too. They deserve the protection of the American justice system, and you should not be able to get away with a crime on Native American land simply because they can't arrest you for it. It happens entirely too often. It is a serious issue, and unfortunately, it is one that does not get nearly enough attention. But, you know, related to this are things like the MMIW phenomenon, the missing and murdered Indigenous women, who just, for some reason, we do not do a very good job of policing that. And Canada, it's worse there. Like, you guys are a lot worse. I'm not saying you guys as individual Canadians. Your government is bad about this. The RCMP is not a police force. It's a paramilitary organization that is intended to keep the natives in line, not protect them. At least our FBI does have a mandate to protect Americans. They don't do a good job a lot of the time, but they do have a mandate for that. So your federal police organization needs to be more of a police organization and less of a... I mean, they're called Mounties, guys. Be so for real right now. And I want to be clear, this isn't just when it comes to Native Americans. The RCMP doesn't do its job for white Canadians either. They just don't do their job. Because, again, their job seems to be police, but in reality, it's peacekeeping. But that's a kind of a wild tangent. My point is, if things like this bother you, and I believe they should, you know, write a letter, call your representatives, and say, hey, I haven't heard about the Presidential Task Force on Missing and Murdered American Indians and Alaska Natives in a while. What's up with that? This is something that was established by the first Trump administration and continued by the Biden administration, and then has just kind of faded since 2022. I haven't heard about it since 2022. They were put together, they released their report, and then it seems that nothing was done. So if there's something you feel like doing political activism about right now that isn't ensuring the national parks continue to get funded, which is the other thing you should be doing, please consider looking into that, because this is a real issue. Native Americans are Americans, and we should be working to, you know, heal the divides, not simply allow them to continue. Now, all of that said, if you would like to support what we're doing here at the Lore Lodge, the easiest way to do that is to subscribe on Patreon for just $1 a month. That will get you access to a bunch of different exclusive content, but probably the most important thing is ad-free episodes. You can watch these with 0 sponsored segments, 0 YouTube added-in ads, and they just go up the same time as these videos, same day, everything. It's just over on Patreon. There are also higher tiers on the Patreon. There's 5, 10, 25. We would appreciate it, but don't, you know, one is enough, really. If all of you did that, we'd be doing really well. Every single one of you who watch the videos, oh boy, we would be making movies by now. I would be putting the History Channel to shame with that kind of a budget. No, like I said, if you want to support us, that's a great way to do it. You can also check out our merch from Bunker Branding. This is the main logo shirt. We also have the old logo shirt, the old logo. There's also one that says Redacted Media on it. There's a Lift Lodge shirt, and I'm going to be adding a couple, hopefully in the new year. And if you would like to taste the Lodge, you can do so by getting coffee from Bunker Branding. All of these are linked in the description. I used to be a barista at an artisan roastery. I know coffee. I'm kind of a coffee snob. Trust me, it's good coffee. I didn't pick it off a shelf. I told Matt Moore, I was like, hey man, I want this, 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 and this. And he said, I can do that for you, sir. And that is why we like Matt Moore. If you're looking for more Lodge, you can get it by going to one of our other channels, like History Unhinged or Weird Bible, or you can check out our live show, which airs Monday nights, unless it doesn't. And if it doesn't, we'll tell you. Sometimes it airs at noon because we had Flint Dibble on, and he was in the UK, so it was a whole thing. You can also catch us on Spotify, like this show and the live show, and I think History Unhinged are all on Spotify now. So if you're a, listen while you drive to work kind of person, go ahead and check it out there. The best way to keep up with what we're doing is to, well, please hit the notification bell and subscribe and all of that, because that's what YouTube really cares about. But the best way to get direct messaging from us is through Discord, and you can go to the link in the description or go to bit.ly/jointhelodge. Lastly, I'd like to thank FlexiSpot for sponsoring this video. I'm sitting in one of their chairs now, and considering I sit in these chairs for hours at a time, multiple times a week, and I never feel sore afterwards, I would recommend checking them out. I think that's just about it. I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.